Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Jonathan McCall. I'm an editor with the Duke Clinical Research Institute Communications Group, and I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about the process of protocol development. This is part of a two-part series. The second part focuses more on the mechanics of writing the protocol, but this is actually some of the process and preparatory steps involved in protocol development. I want to tell you first a little bit about my background. I've been at DCRI for a while. I started off in data management here on some fairly large cardiac trials. More lately, I've been working with the American College of Surgeons Oncology Group prior to coming to communications. And while there, I was working a great deal on protocol development for a large number of phase 2 and phase 3 trials over a period of about a year and a half. We had over a dozen trials in development. So my perspective that I'm going to be bringing you today is that of someone who's been working in a relatively small and young cooperative group that was funded through the NCI, which is an NIH group. I've tried to make this presentation, though, as broadly applicable as possible and not keep it entirely parochial to NIH processes. So I'm hoping that even if you're not necessarily involved in NIH or NCI funded processes, you'll find something useful in this. As I said, we're going to talk mostly about the process today, and we're going to start with a brief overview of what that entails. This is a very often forgotten but very important aspect of clinical protocols. The focus is so much on the idea itself that sight is often lost of what actually goes in to bringing an idea to successful fruition, to creating a successful protocol that can accrue patients, that results in useful data at the end of the road. And I've quoted here from a paper that's one of a relatively small number of studies actually done on the process of protocol development. Dr. Gennari did a survey, as an ethnographic survey, as he called it, of the Southwest Oncology Group, which is one of the older and better established cancer cooperative groups, and identified the fact that protocol development as a process has a huge impact on the ultimate quality of the research being conducted, and that if we want better clinical research data, we need to look at improving the process of protocol development. To put it in a less elegant manner, we can say garbage in, garbage out. A poorly designed, poorly implemented protocol is not likely to yield good data. There are two key elements to keep in mind about protocol writing, and I'll use the phrase protocol development interchangeably with that. If I slip back and forth, don't let that perturb you. It is a collaborative process. There is never one person who writes a protocol. There are going to be multiple people providing input for this. The PI is the obvious person to look at. That's the closest thing we have to an author. That's usually the person who has proposed the study idea. But along the way, there are going to be subspecialists likely to be involved with the protocol. If there's an imaging portion, or a lab science portion, that person may be writing a whole chapter, so to speak, of the protocol. Nurses and CRAs will need to give their input. Statisticians, they're regulatory experts, information technology experts. Some of you are used to the industry-funded clinical trial, may not have been aware of this part of the process, but cooperative groups frequently have to do everything from the ground up. Their coordinating centers are responsible for orchestrating every aspect of a clinical trial, and that is more the norm among NIH-funded studies. And sometimes even protocol editors get involved. Sadly, not enough. Part of this is going to be, I'm maybe tooting my own horn here, but I am going to advocate for greater awareness of the importance of the role of an editor or a central controller for this process. It is an intellectual and a creative task. There are going to be multiple people providing ideas. Not always the best ideas seem that way at first, and it may take some battling out among competing ideas. The other part to keep in mind about the protocol development process is that it is constantly changing. It's like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree. First of all, you have to keep in mind that there are going to be multiple contributors for a protocol. And because of this, there will be differences of opinion. There will be content changes in response to review and critique. Sometimes this will be something that a reviewer has commented on a piece of the protocol. You may agree with this, or you may disagree but not have a choice. You may find yourself mandated to make a change, or else you can give up on the protocol altogether. There may be content changes necessitated by some new clinical information, information about the safety of a drug. Prior to coming to work for the editorial group, I was working on the development of a phase 3 study that involved the use of a COX-2 inhibitor for cancer therapy as an anti-inflammatory. Of course, it just so happened that the news about Vioxx, rofecoxib, I believe, hit the news a couple of weeks before the protocol was due to open. And so that created some issues that had to be responded to. There is also the aspect of content changes that are dictated by the changing regulatory landscape and the development of new ways of thinking about ethics. This is a part that is constantly in flux. This is an ever-changing landscape. There is a greater awareness now of issues related to patient autonomy. The trend that we've seen in protocols is for patients to be more involved in their care on protocols, more aware of what's going on, and with a greater share of participation in the process. We're going to talk now about some of the preparatory steps in protocol development, and I want to stress the importance of good preparation. You probably thought that having the big idea was the most important part, and in a sense it is. You can't do anything without the bright idea, but between the bright idea and the successful protocol, there are some hurdles that will have to be cleared. Your protocol is going to have to seem like a worthwhile project to other physicians, to nurses, to CRAs, to patients' families, and to reviewers, scientific reviewers, statistical reviewers, and institutional review boards. Thinking ahead about potential challenges can make the difference between a protocol that stalls out at the level of internal review and a protocol that can be successfully implemented in the field. Now, I do want to add a note of caution here. It is not possible to second guess every eventuality that may arise, and there comes a time of diminishing returns. You can't hope to have a protocol sail through the review process without anybody ever responding to something that you'll need to change. What you can do, though, is remove the obvious obstacles by a sort of scientific and clinical and regulatory due diligence. You can eliminate some of the more obvious roadblocks in the way, and the results will be a better, leaner, cleaner protocol. Some of the questions to ask in the beginning of protocol development, there's some basic feasibility questions to talk about. The first of these is, are there enough patients out there to meet my accrual goals? Can I enroll enough patients to this study? This isn't really so much of a consideration perhaps if you're looking at an early breast cancer study or a heart disease trial. You're probably not going to run up against a lack of absolute numbers in a situation like that. But at the other extreme, if you're trying to do a study on adrenal carcinoma, you may not have enough patient population for statistical power. You need to be aware of potential competition. If there are other trials in a particular disease area, Have they already started enrolling? Are they likely to come online while your study is going on? Are you going to compete for a patient population? And you may also be competing not just for patients, but for access to investigational drugs and devices. Access to these is rationed through the FDA or the NCI or whoever holds the IND in a particular situation. So that may be an aspect to consider as well. And one of the most difficult things to assess is the question of clinical equipoise. The question is there equipoise on a given issue? And I've put in caps here, not should there be. The two things are very different. A lot of times you'll find that a clinical question that has not been definitively decided in the realm of evidence-based medicine, nonetheless there may be a lot of strong opinions out there in the clinical world about what is the best treatment. Now that's a long-standing and vexed question in clinical investigations, but if there is too much polarization in the medical community, that can spell problems, because you'll have a situation where physicians will be unwilling to enroll patients on a study if they sincerely believe that one treatment really is better than another, even if that hasn't been definitively scientifically decided yet. They may feel it's unethical to enroll patients on the study. They may choose not to present it to patients. That's a very real problem. One of the things that I'd recommend for assessing some of these issues, you can look at the viability of polling techniques to assess kind of the lay of the land. You can research things like national databases for patient populations, and certainly you can also use web resources and databases to look at trials that are in development, clinicaltrials.gov being an example of that. But on our more delicate question here, you can perhaps poll potential physicians who might be enrolling on a study through an email or a web-based poll to find out what is the general consensus in the community, which kind of leads us into our next round, which is physicians and institutions. How likely are other physicians to be receptive to your study idea? And this is a place where polling can really pay off. If there is a pronounced hostility to a study idea, it's obviously not going to be able to enroll patients. If it's too pronounced, you may need to go back and look at your study idea again and see if there's not a problem with your design or your basic assumptions. And I'd like to raise the issue here too of one of the things that I heard repeatedly while working on protocols at the stage at which ideas were being debated. I would hear someone say, well, we don't do it that way at my institution. And that was a problem that occurred over and over again. Was an assumption was made about how treatments were performed, how tests were done, sometimes how the pathologist was paid. There were all these assumptions made on a kind of parochialism about a particular institution. And the group I was with had members that ranged from people who were in large academic institutions down to people who had a small 1 or 2 physician practice. So there was quite a broad range of practices there, not to mention resources. You need to ask questions about resources. Would participating in the study cause a drain on the physical or financial resources of a given practice? Are the institutions, your prospective institutions that are going to be participating in your trial, do they have the technology necessary? Do they have the expertise? Do they have support infrastructure? That means a trained corps of CRAs to administer the trial. Do they have the levels of training needed to perform the study? Do you have specific lab or hardware mandated for the trial that may not be universal? And perhaps most importantly, there's the issue of what the patients are going to think about the trial. Are patients going to find your study acceptable? Enrolling patients on clinical trials is difficult. It's hard to talk to patients in language that is non-technical, that is non-coercive, and yet at the same time is thorough and exhaustive. It takes time, it takes effort, and it takes resources, and it takes a skilled and trained person to do all this. Are patients likely to find the study onerous? Are they going to have to do a lot of driving back and forth? Are they going to have to return for follow-ups in a way that might disrupt their family life? How are your patients going to learn about your study? Advertising for a study in the broadest sense, no matter how that's done, it's a very sharply constrained activity. Any material that you try to publicize a clinical trial with, that's going to be subject to IRB review at the local level and possibly at the national, depending on how your trial is set up. Are your patients going to have risks on this study? Almost all medical research entails some risk. What costs might they have to bear? We've talked about transportation, but are they going to have out-of-pocket expenses? Do you have procedures that aren't covered by Medicare? These are all questions to ask before embarking on your clinical trial. And finally, you need to think about logistics. Again, I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who worked in a cooperative group where everything was built from the ground up by that cooperative group. So we were responsible for every aspect of the clinical trial. But some questions are, how are you going to accomplish randomization? Are you going to have to build a randomization hub? Are you going to have someone on call in case your randomization goes down? Are you going to be able to automate certain things? How about drug shipments? How is that going to be handled? Is there going to be an interface with your randomization hub and the FDA? How about unblinding? The Poison Control Center is going to have to be involved in that. How are you going to collect specimens? How are they going to be stored? How are they going to be shipped? Who's going to do the reading of the specimens? How will you audit your sites for performance? That includes both if there is, let's say, a medical or surgical intervention, you'll need to ensure that they're performing the study correctly, but you'll also be auditing them on the quality of their data. You're going to be auditing them on their compliance with regulatory issues. Again, we're looking at this from the NCI, NIH side of the picture. It's true that for industry-funded trials, you can probably anticipate that there will be monitors, a staff of monitors that will be overseeing these aspects of the trial. But in the cooperative group paradigm, for instance, you would not. You would have a staff of auditors who visited a site at intervals of perhaps 6 months and then doing a sample of cases, not a constant looking over your shoulder monitoring system that you see in a lot of commercial pharmaceutical studies. You need to think about how your data is going to be handled. How is it going to be collected and transferred? How is it going to be stored? How is it going to be analyzed? How is it going to be validated and audited? And how are you going to respond to the inevitable help desk issues? If your randomization hub goes down, who deals with that problem? If someone tries to enroll a patient at midnight and on the West Coast and suddenly has a doubt about the eligibility criteria, someone's going to need to be on call to answer those questions 24 hours a day. And it may be the PI. A lot of the things you see in NIH trials is that there's only so much that responsibility can be delegated in terms of authorizing things on a clinical trial, and exceptions are generally frowned upon. So it may be that the PI has to rule on a particular issue. We're going to talk also now about assembling the protocol team. This is a little more tricky than it probably sounds at first glance, because at first glance you would think we can just run down this roster. This is a list of people that we are likely to need on a clinical protocol. Obviously, you'll have the principal investigators. These are the people who have the idea that first articulate the design of the study. You're likely to need some specialists or sub-PIs on a study. If there's an imaging component, if it's a cancer study, you may need nuclear medicine or radiology. You may need surgical specialists, a medical oncologist. You may need a genetics counselor. There are a lot of subspecialties that may be involved in the protocol development process. You're going to need the perspectives of a nurse or CRA. You'll need a regulatory expert involved in some capacity to vet your protocol for regulatory compliance. You'll need a safety desk person who's going to vet your adverse events section and possibly be in charge of safety reporting once the study is actually active. You are going to need a statistician, and this person's going to need to be involved from the very beginning to ensure that you've got a workable, valid, and robust study design, that your study is adequately powered. Sometimes very good ideas founder on an inability to meet the demands of statistical power for significance on a study, especially in disease areas that only have relatively small populations or have other issues surrounding them. Data management, there will need to be someone involved on that end to handle the logistics of collecting and storing the data. Patient advocacy can provide invaluable perspectives, especially when it comes to writing your informed consent documents for your study and for vetting the practicability of a study from a patient standpoint. You'll need a study coordinator who can kind of put all these pieces together and keep the working knowledge of the protocol in their head. And you're going to need a protocol editor. Sometimes this can be the same person as the study coordinator. It may be a research fellow. But you're going to need a central controller who will assemble the protocol and control the process of protocol development. It sounds easy, but this is actually where some of the difficulty creeps in, because we've got about 10 different specialties represented here in this bare bones chart. All of these people may have strong opinions about what needs to be in that protocol, and all of them are going to have a voice, all of them are going to have a say. But it becomes a particularly vexed question when we realize that not everybody necessarily speaks with equal authority as part of this process. The typical process is that you submit your proposal. You have your study idea. You submit it for some internal review process. Perhaps it's your local institution. If you're in a cooperative group, there may be an interest group for a particular disease site. They pass your study idea. They say they're interested in it. Let's see it developed a little bit more. You generate a complete draft. You then iteratively review and revise the draft over a series of passes of protocol development. And then you submit the final draft for some reviewing body, usually a higher level reviewing body, let's say the FDA, an NIH group like the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program. Gennari notes that the details within step number 3, which is iteratively review and revise the drafts, is somewhat complex. That is a massive understatement. This is the process. This cycling of developing a protocol through a kind of accretion of knowledge and ideas, and also an ablation of things that shouldn't be in there. It is important to have a realistic timetable when you embark on this project. However long you think it's going to take, it's going to take longer than that. Just as a purely anecdotal thing, I can tell you that protocols that I began working on in early 2003 are just now becoming active. They're just now being opened to enrollment. That's nearly 3 years of protocol development. Now, I don't advance this as necessarily being typical. There are a lot of things that can happen. There are a lot of different exigencies, and no two protocols are alike. But I've spoken with a number of my peers at other cooperative groups, and there is a general consensus that they seldom see protocols go from initial draft to enrollment, being open for enrollment in less than a year. It's a long process, and there's no telling what's going to occur along the way in terms of the changing clinical landscape, the changing regulatory landscape. You need to be aware of that, and be aware of the intersection of your own and other people's schedules. We're talking about physicians here. They're very busy people. Nurses, very busy people. Very difficult to get a hold of at a moment's notice. Often schedules are filled for months, if not years in advance. There needs to be some thought given to how you're going to work out the logistics of getting together and working on these projects. It's also complicated by the fact that protocol development may be, we think of this as a group, but it's seldom people sitting in a room together like this. Your statistician may be halfway across the country. Your surgeon may be in India. Your medical oncologist or your serologist might be in Canada. And you may be all meeting by telephone or by rounds of email. It's more the exception than the rule that you have face-to-face meetings. You need to create project benchmarks and timetables, and you need to make everyone aware of those. And you need to be aware of review cycles. If you're trying to get a protocol approved, you need to be aware of whatever body you're submitting it to. They undoubtedly have a schedule of review. It's usually a rolling review process, but if you miss a window, you're going to have to wait for the next time around. And keep in mind that these are human institutions. People go on vacation in December. They go on vacation in July and August. There are months that are better than others for submitting protocols for review. Unfortunately, everyone else knows about those months too. And so you may be seeing a logjam at any given time. And you may find that your protocol just didn't make it for review that day. They had to table it for next week or next month. Another thing to keep in mind is establishing your lines of communication. The most important question is who's in charge. Obviously, the PI is in charge ultimately of the protocol, but in terms of various aspects of the development, you need to have a clear understanding of who gets final say in any given area. Does your PI necessarily have final say in the regulatory aspect or the safety aspect? Probably not. They may not know that much about the particulars of that area. Should they, they're not necessarily going to have final say in a number of places. But this is another area where communication is very important because there may be differences of opinion that have to be sorted out. Defining who has final responsibility for a given task. If your safety desk person is in charge of the safety section, then that's the person who signs off on it finally. Not necessarily the PI, but the safety desk officer. You need to examine how consensus decisions are going to be made. I've sat on a number of telephone conferences where a problem was threshed out, and then everyone thought the problem had been fixed. Everyone was happy. Everyone said good night. And then the next week, everyone thought that their viewpoint had prevailed. And they were outraged when their viewpoint didn't show up in the finished protocol. So there needs to be some way of identifying when the decision's made, summing it up, saying, okay, we have resolved that we're going to do the following elements for this protocol, and then communicate that to the people working on the protocol in some written form. Email is obviously a good choice. You also need to look at how you're going to communicate information both among your protocol group and between the protocol group and outside entities. When you are working on a protocol, you'll frequently get, the word will get out. And if you're working on something that people are really interested in, they may start calling you out of the blue saying, when is the protocol going to be ready? It's very important that a protocol group speak with one voice on this. If you, obviously, if two different people are giving conflicting information, that causes confusion. Also keep in mind there are certain kinds of information that are not appropriate for dissemination to people outside of certain circles. Your statistician is going to be very wrathful with you if you release certain kinds of information to local PIs on a project. There's certain information that's for the DSMC only. There's certain information that it's not appropriate for anybody to see, such as protected health information. I'm quoting from Gennari again here. Gennari has identified kind of a key cultural issue in protocol development, that there are different levels of status involved among the members of a project, and the clinician researcher, which is our PI here, is the highest level authority. And notes that it's often hard or impossible for others, such as protocol editors, to make demands on these researchers. And demands here could include demands on time, demands on availability, and demands on the content of the protocol. There's not an easy solution for this problem. Gennari and authors have identified some technical aids to this problem. They're interested in a kind of a process-oriented software development that can aid that process. I don't know personally. I've never used such a device. They may well be helpful. It's outside of my experience and expertise. I will say that it's important to try to foster a culture of collegiality on the project. Everybody who is working on this project is going to be contributing an important element of it, and everyone needs their say. Ignoring people is foolish, because presumably you've picked a team for relevant experience, and you wouldn't pick somebody for the benefit of their experience and then ignore what they have to say. So it's important that you hash out a means of having consensus decisions. I'm sorry if this sounds a little vague and woolly, but unfortunately no two projects are alike. And I'm more advancing this as something to think about than having an actual panacea to offer. Every group's a little bit different. Every group of people is going to be a little bit different. But it's something you need to think about when embarking on protocol development. And we're going to talk about some stuff that's a little more concrete at this point, which is managing the process. Some of the problems that have been identified are ineffective or excessive review and revision. This is going to be very familiar to anybody who's worked on a protocol before, is that sometimes a very frustrating thing starts happening. You make a change to a protocol draft, you revise it. Someone who wasn't there at the meeting the previous month sees it and changes it all back. And then the process starts over again. The arguing starts, the wrangling starts. And then you come around to that decision again, you remake that decision, and then someone who wasn't at that meeting changes it back, and the argument starts again. That's something that we need to look at ways to short circuit before it happens. This leads directly to our next point, which is poor version control. There's no way around it that you are going to have to distribute multiple copies of a protocol out into the wild, so to speak. You may need each of these persons who are working on your project, they're reviewing it, they're critiquing it. Maybe you've asked them to use track changes in Microsoft Word, but they didn't, and decided they just overwrite whatever was in there. And then the poor protocol editor or research fellow or study coordinator who's charged with integrating this has this terrible task of trying to splice this information together. Another thing that may happen is that the person may have stepped outside of their area of authority, and the radiologist may have decided to tweak your dose escalation tables on the basis of something he or she just read in the latest issue of JAMA. That is another problem that has to be dealt with up front. Integrating input from the contributors, that's the editor's problem. And poor coordination among the members, and we've already alluded to that. This is people who aren't there for a particular meeting, who didn't get the memo, who didn't read the memo when they got it. We'll look at some possible solutions to these problems. One person needs to be identified who's responsible for a given section of content in the protocol. Another person needs to be identified as being responsible for integrating that content into the protocol. You need a central controller for your protocol who's going to manage that draft. They're going to have sole possession of the master copy of that draft. They're going to be able to control access to it. They're going to be able to control access to the files that are being used. You're going to need to establish a process for deciding on how critiques and suggestions are either accepted or rejected. This goes back to our discussion about the consensus decisions where everyone thinks that their viewpoint has been carried. You need to establish a system of identifying some way of establishing what the decision was. Now, my own suggestion for this, something that has worked well for me, is in any instance where there was, for instance, a meeting face-to-face or a phone teleconference, was to take detailed minutes of that, summarize the key decision points, and then distribute an email to all the people involved with those points highlighted, and then ask for an acknowledgement of the receipt of that communication. Now, this is not particularly intricate stuff. It's pretty obvious, but it goes a long way toward ensuring that you don't have a situation where people don't get the message. There will always be someone who doesn't read the email, who doesn't read the draft, and says, but, you know, I didn't see this, I didn't read it, you didn't send it to me. That always happens, but you can minimize the impact of that by simply having a process where you ensure that that excuse is not in fact valid for anybody. There's some technological solutions. I'm advancing this as a possibility you might want to explore. I personally have no experience using these kinds of materials, but there are software packages for collaborative writing projects. The general consensus appears to be that this is not a mature technology yet, and it's not really suited for this particular application, which is writing clinical trials, writing protocols. But they are out there, and it may be something to consider. It may be creating your own in-house system might be something to consider when embarking on protocol development, because it does quickly snowball. The amount of communications passing back and forth has to be managed somehow, and that's either a very resource-intensive process for a person, or it's something that you need to find a way to automate. But these technological solutions may be something that you can help manage your communications flow with. I'm afraid I didn't have access to any luxuries during my time as a protocol editor, and we kind of had to develop our own more human-based solutions. One thing that can help is being mindful of constraints. Protocols have a way of turning into fishing expeditions. There's a refrain I've heard many times in protocol development sometimes from the PI, sometimes from other doctors. As long as we're here, why don't we get this sample while we're here? As long as we're here, we'll get the height, the weight, the blood pressure. We'll get a little bit of serum, we'll get a little bit of plasma, we'll get a little bit of DNA, some RNA, a little tissue sample here and there. And the next thing you know, you've got an everything in the kitchen sink protocol. We'll talk a little bit more in the next session about some of the problems that causes. One of the chief problems is it drives the statistician berserk. you start adding data that's not directly connected to your primary endpoints or to safety, and your protocol becomes loaded down with things that aren't really important to your research question. It slows down your protocol, it makes it unwieldy in the field, it's a burden on the people administering it, it's a burden on the people participating in it, it's a burden on data collection. One of the truisms that I heard when I was working in data management at DCRI, I don't know if this figure is still correct, but the figure that was bandied about at the time was that every variable on a case report form represented about $100 over its lifetime in terms of what it cost to enter the data, what it costs to transmit it, what it costs to clean it. If that figure may or may not be valid, it's anecdotal, and I kind of suspect it isn't. But it does cost something. There is an overhead involved there. And think about that. If it costs N dollars and you have 1,000 patients and you have how many times N variables on your forms times 1,000 patients, do you have that much money? Are these elements sufficiently important that you're willing to pay the expense in dollars, in effort, in intangible investment in a protocol? Again, the statisticians generally have fought a long rearguard action against this kind of mission creep on a protocol. Keep it lean, keep it functional. We've touched on this aspect a little bit, although not by this name, maintaining control of your protocol through what's called the single scriber approach. That's making sure that one person is charged with integrating the various aspects of the protocol. This person's also going to be your communications hub. They're going to be responsible for circulating drafts, disseminating versions of the protocol, and ultimately for sending it off for review and probably for responding to that review. You'll need a procedure for collecting sign-off on drafts before they're released into the wild, whatever the wild is, whether it's sending it off for review, sending it to an IRB, or actually activating it on your menu of trials. You'll need to make sure that every person has vetted their relevant sections of the protocol. Sometimes a checklist that you can run down and identify that you haven't left out a section of the protocol. That may seem like a howler, that may seem like a terrible goof, but it can really happen. Not all protocols are the same, and somebody may have underestimated the necessity for a particular section. So having a checklist can help you make sure that when it comes time to send that protocol off for review, everything is present and accounted for. There are actually a lot of models out there that you can use for this purpose, and we'll touch on that in just a moment. And remember that regardless of your procedures, the final responsibility rests with the PI. They're the one who has the ownership of this project. But final responsibility in name is not the same as final responsibility on the ground. The person putting the protocol together is going to have the functional responsibility for making sure everything goes smoothly. This is also, doing this is to embark on a cyclical process. Drafting a protocol extends not just through the development process, but into the submission process. When you send it off for review or approval, people are going to need to be vested with the authority to respond to these reviews. The PI is obviously going to be responding to this review, but a lot of the heavy lifting gets done by the protocol editor and perhaps by the research fellow who's working on the study. They're going to be the ones who are actually drafting the response letter and making sure that the protocol has been changed suitably in response to the review, and also on maintaining control over that. This is where a lot of errors creep into protocols, is someone cuts and pastes blocks of text in response to some critique or review. They cut some piece out of the protocol, and all of a sudden an entire section doesn't make sense anymore because no one actually read it through after the edit. This is a fairly typical review cycle. It starts at number 1 with your draft of your initial idea being approved by a local research committee. It may be institutional, may be an interest group. It gets drafted and submitted for higher level review. That higher level review will return it with comments requiring response or modification. I have to say, in my time working as a protocol editor on somewhere between 12 and 15 protocols, I never, ever, ever saw a protocol or concept returned from the reviewers and they said, well, that looks good the way it is, go right ahead. There was always something, and sometimes it was a lot of somethings, and suddenly your little 80-person phase 2 liver met study became a 4-armed 2,000 patient colorectal cancer study. It has a way of happening, but you cannot count on a protocol going through review without you having to respond to something. Then you'll need to modify your protocol in response to those comments, or if you're sufficiently convinced of your rightness on a matter, you need to prepare a response saying, no, we will not be implementing these suggestions, and here's why. That's a perfectly valid approach to take, and a sufficiently well-argued case can carry the point. But either way, there's going to be an investment of some effort at that point, and then the cycle begins again. And this may happen many, many times. I've seen protocols that have gone through 6 of these iterations, 8 of these iterations. It never stops. In a sense, it really does never stop, because your protocol will be amended at some point. There's no getting around it. Finally, we're going to talk about some of the resources and guidance documents that are available. The NIH maintains a wonderful site called Proto-Mechanics that is their master guidance document for the protocols that they implement at the Warren Grant Clinical Center, Warren Grant Magnuson Clinical Center. It covers a lot of ground, including how to write a protocol, what are the roles and responsibilities of the people involved, how do you accomplish regulatory compliance, how to go about the scientific and statistical design of a protocol, compensation and reimbursement issues. That's a very thorny question. One thing to keep in mind is that in the world of research, some industry-funded studies may be adequately remunerative, or they may not. The NCI studies that we worked on, the common wisdom was that they were money losers for the physicians who participated in them, and that it was a certain sacrifice on their part to undertake this. Nobody gets rich off of doing scientific research in the clinical setting. There's an investment of labor, there's an investment of time, and often there's a certain sacrifice on a practice in doing this research. So that becomes a particularly important issue, because you can't tax people more than they can bear in that regard. This is the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program's kind of clearinghouse site for guidance documents. Despite the fact that this is focused on cancer research, I think it would be valuable for people in just about any field. The templates are based on the NIH's master documents, so there's a broad applicability for NIH-oriented process. And the Investigator's Handbook is another particularly valuable document. It's very extensive. It's over 100 pages of PDF documentation that cover the design and development of Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, and even Phase 4 post-marketing studies. There are protocol templates available there as well. This is particularly valuable for someone who doesn't want to start from absolute scratch. These templates, again, are modeled on the NIH master template. They're very broadly applicable. And perhaps most importantly, there's a lot of regulatory and process guidance, particularly for dealing with adverse event reporting. There's the NIH roadmap site. This is a listing of all the NIH roadmap initiatives and opportunities for basic science and correlative science on clinical trials. This is a useful site to get kind of an indication of where certain NIH interest is accumulating in a given therapeutic area or basic research area. And you know, a good place to explore if you're thinking about maybe looking for some collaborative opportunities on a protocol. Now the next two are going to be some of the most important in terms of the nuts and bolts functioning of a clinical protocol. The Office of Human Research Protection, and I'm going to flip quickly to the next one, the Office of Human Subjects Research. These are somewhat similar in terms of their bailiwicks. These are guidelines for specifically with a focus on the human side of human research. This contains a lot of information on regulatory issues. There are, on the OHSR site, there are a very valuable set of sheets, guidance sheets, for writing research protocols and for writing informed consents, which is an area that's often kind of left as an afterthought on protocols, unfortunately, because it is the interface between your protocol and the potential subject. In summary, proper preparation can't ensure that your protocol is going to be successful, but it can be the difference between success and failure. There's no guarantee of anything, but thinking ahead about potential problems can make all the difference in protocol development. And keep in mind that they are the work of many hands. They are collaborative projects, and they are going to require some care to ensure coordination, cooperation among a lot of different people with different viewpoints and with some very strong ideas. Are there any questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for coming here.